Hey everyone, welcome back to Living the Jesus Way with my guest, Hurmon Hamilton, who has written an upcoming book on the subject that'll be available in the fall, and he's preached a whole sermon series on it. Well, our purpose with this podcast is to discuss how the Jesus Way can help build bridges across differences. It's a way to open avenues of conversation and heal broken relationships. So let me start with a simple question for the audience. When you strongly disagree with someone, what's your instinct? Do you label them? Oh, they're just one of those people. Or they
Mm.
think like that because they're on that side. Or maybe you jump right into making your own case, defending your own position, pointing out where they're wrong. Most of us do that from time to time. But what if that's not where real understanding begins? What if it begins in their story? Because here's the reality. Labels tend to flatten people. They reduce someone to a category, but stories humanize people.
Mm.
They help us see the person behind the position. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the power of story and how it can begin to break the labels that often keep us stuck and divided. Well, Pastor Hurmon, I've been looking forward to this discussion and the insights you can share.
Thanks for having me, man.
Well, now, last episode, we talked about the bigger picture, how divided things are right now, and how the Jesus way offers a different path that builds bridges instead of walls. So, today, we're going to talk about the first step in the process, and that's engaging at the level of stories. And we'll discuss how to break the labels we often have for people. So, let me ask our listeners this. What's your story? Not your entire life story, but the experiences that shaped how you see the world, how you formed your beliefs, and why you care about the things that you care about. And here's the follow-up question. Do you actually know the stories of the people you disagree with? Pastor Hurmon, why are stories so powerful? And can you give us an example of, perhaps from your own life and from the life of Jesus, where you see the power of stories at work?
Our lives are simply a composite of our stories.
Yeah,
Our triumphs, our traumas, our dreams and nightmares, our accomplishments and our failures, they all come in the form of story. I like to also say that we think in story.
hmm.
We've never, oftentimes we are not conscious of it, but when we hear a song, spiritual, romantic, whatever the case song it is, for me, you've heard me tease in messages. The song that was playing when I met my wife was "You Are My Lady,"
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so whenever I hear that song, it triggers a memory that is connected to a story
Yeah.
of where I was at that time, how Rhonda came, what she said, how we connected, etc. So our lives are a composite of story. So if you really want to engage me, understand me, you want to get to know me, you have to be open to learning about my story and not just my positions of my theology.
Right. And you did a great job of that, of your own story in our first episode. Yep.
Absolutely. So example is, you take from Jesus's life. One of my favorite stories, one of the first disciples of Jesus is Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector, which in that day and time, in the Jewish context, that meant that he was a Jewish person working for the Roman government. And he was authorized, once he collected the amount of taxes due by the Roman government, he could add as much as he wanted. And that tax collectors drove a lot of their fellow countrymen and women into poverty and debt
Yeah.
experiences. So when he came to Jesus and said, I want to follow you, later on, he throws a party in his house and he invites all of his friends. And it's all these tax collectors, and the writer who's describing it is so many of these different kinds of people who he just says, and other disreputable people. I'm in that group, right? I do have that sense, just you come up, you imagine what that was. And then it says, listen, New Living Translation, there were many people like this among Jesus's followers.
Yep.
I love this. All right,
Hmm.
and so it paints this picture of Jesus is in the house, the party is happening, all these disreputable people are surrounding him. They're loving Jesus. It's something about him that's contagious. He's engaging with them. Well, what is it? How is he engaging with them? He's listening to their stories. He's not condemning them, pointing fingers at them, talking about her. No. And they're, whether it's the prostitute or the tax collector or whoever the other person is, he's listening, being empathetic, and he's doing all that without compromising his conviction. So that's the contagious piece. We see this in Jesus all the time. From my own life, I'll tell you, what brought this into focus for me was the work I did with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. I was a pastor of an African-American Presbyterian church located in Roxbury at a time when young African-American men were being essentially slaughtered. Violence, gun violence was at an all-time high.
Mm.
And on this particular occasion, I lived in what was called the pastor's manse, the house that the church owned for the pastor to live in. The house was about a half a block from where the church is. My son was about 3 years old, and he had just entered the house, having been playing outside, when I heard gunfire.
Wow.
And I ran out and discovered that there was a young man who had been shot and killed, literally, lying in the streets between the church that I pastored and where the pastor lived, where I lived.
Wow.
It was the greatest symbol of powerlessness. Soon thereafter, I was talking to one of my friends. I was really messed up about it. I mean, I was traumatized. I was just horrified. I was, essentially questioning the effectiveness of ministry. And I had a really good friend, John Heinemeyer, the late John Heinemeyer, who was a Lutheran pastor who came to Boston with the vision of building what is called a broad-based organization. That's what GBI was. He had been talking to me on and off for months. In this particular occasion, I said, John, listen, I don't even know how to respond to this. The kid gets shot and killed between my church and where I live. And I said, and just look around here. I'm standing on the street. There were tons of churches up and down the street. On my block, there was my church, and literally right next door, there was another storefront church. A half a block down, there was another church, and you could just go on and on. Churches everywhere. And I said, John, we're so powerless. This is escalating. And he said, Hurmon, there are churches everywhere, but the problem is, the reason why we don't have much power is because we're not in relationship with one another. And he said, if we were in relationship, we could build the power to transform some systemic stuff. For the first time, he got my attention. And then he said, look, that's why I'm trying to build this organization, blah, 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 blah. So I opened the basement of my church, and he had already done tons of work. And on one evening, 50 people showed up. They were all clergy. Half was Catholic, half was Protestant, one major leader of the Jewish community. And the first thing, because this is key to broad-based organizing, you always start with story. So we pastors, we didn't know each other. So we did rounds where we paired off, and we were given a question. What's your greatest passion? Like you said earlier, it's not your whole story, right? What's your greatest passion? What that brings you into ministry? And what's your greatest pain? So when it got to my greatest pain, I'm talking to I'm an African-American evangelical pastor. I'm talking to a reform, progressive rabbi. And I shared my story about the killing and the shooting and in terms of my greatest pain. That rabbi shares their story about the alarming rate of suicides that was happening in the suburbs among white teenage kids. All of a sudden, what looked like totally two different folk who had very little in common, we are now talking essentially about the same story. Yeah. Young people losing their lives prematurely. It looks one way in the suburbs, another way. That totally, and we connected. You can imagine how we connected. Our pain connected us together deeply. And multiply that by 50, multiply that by literally 5,000 over the course of the year. We had 5,000 of those conversations. Out of that, GBI was born, and kind of the rest was history. And everything we did for the next 10 years started at the sharing and exchanging of stories.
Yeah, and I can imagine that, as you've described, is once you share stories, things shift. You look at people you look at people differently.
Yes,
Whereas you probably they probably had a stereotype of you, you had a stereotype of them,
absolutely.
and then things begin to shift, and you really have a a deeper relationship.
Yes, exactly. To reinforce your point, prior to that, this is a someone who I would say would be my colleague, but it was just a perfunctory. I mean, they're Jewish and liberal. I'm Black, evangelical, and Presbyterian and Christian. The colleague was a loose term. But after the sharing of the story, we really were colleagues. I
Hmm.
felt like this is my colleague. I ultimately felt like, in a unique sense, somewhere between brothers and colleagues, the
Yeah,
intimacy that happened between us, even though significant theological differences and socio-political differences. No, no, no,
sure.
no, no. It's all that remained, but our hearts connected in a way
Yeah.
that made us see each other differently and feel differently about each other.
So there's real understanding and humanizing, I
That's
guess,
right.
among you. And tell me, because the audience may not know this, but I'm aware of this GBIO, the great work that you did when you got this group together. You want to just take a little aside and describe what you
Oh
got
yeah,
your
thank you.
group
Yeah,
did?
at the end of the day, GBIO became an organization that was made up of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Some of the largest institutions in those categories, religious institutions in the greater Boston area. And the organization itself became one of the most powerful religious organizations in the state. By the time, and I was one of many founding leaders, the 50 founding leaders, and ultimately president of the organization for a good 8 years. The approach that we took to build the organization was, in fact, the approach that we took to figure out what issues we were going to tackle, because the whole goal of that organization was we just agreed to disagree on all the other stuff that separated us. But we were trying to build enough power to really make a difference in some areas that otherwise would not change. And so through what we call house meetings, churches like RPC would have a series of meetings, small group meetings around the same questions. What's your passion? What's your pain? The first issue we discovered that we had in common, at least across the inner city, was the lack of books in the inner city schools. No new books in 15, 20 years. They were
Hmm.
copying stuff. So anyway, we organized around that and ultimately convinced the mayor and the powers that be to set aside enough money to purchase brand new books for the school. Then we won a victory on affordable housing. We discovered that nursing home workers who are primarily Haitians were being horribly mistreated in nursing homes. And so we organized and won some significant victories around that. And then ultimately, we invited, because of the kind of track record, to participate in what became the battle to win near universal health care.
Mhm.
And in all of these iterations, it was our ability to harness, shepherd, and communicate and organize around the stories of the people that made us, just pretty uh, indispensable in that work. And ultimately, we were a huge player in helping to win near universal health care.
So yeah, so where you started out with a group of people that probably labeled each other, uh,
Mm-hmm.
disagreed on any number of things, and theologically, certainly, among other things, and probably politically, you're able to work together. You saw each other as people, as humans, and it made a big difference. I mean, obviously,
Huge.
you guys did some good work. So tell me this though, with people sharing their stories, and it sounds, and your group did that, and you kind of understood each other even better. But the other part of sharing the story is listening.
Right.
And so tell me, what advice would you give to us as we maybe engage with other people and we ask them to tell their story? What would you say about what we should do as listeners in that situation?
There's a tap passage in Isaiah that says that the day will come where the sovereignty of God's power will rest so heavily upon the earth that nations will be at peace genuinely, and they will beat their swords into plowshares. And I think it's a really great passage to talk about the mind shift that has to happen if we're going to engage genuinely in experiencing and getting to know people through their stories. Because most of us, I may just speak for myself, for many years, hearing somebody's story, we're trained to argue, to debate, to persuade. Even in our evangelical world, we want as many people to come to know Jesus as possible, and so we're always thinking about that. And there's nothing wrong with that for sure. But the notion of just engaging with someone's story from a point of curiosity, I'm not trying to persuade, I'm not trying to convince. I just want to uniquely get to know who you are, no strings attached. So I want to move from, the sword, from defending myself, attacking you,
Right.
subduing you, to the plowshare, really breaking open some hard ground and planting some seeds that are genuine seeds of love and interest and curiosity in who you are. So, we have to have a different mindset. I'm not trying to win anything here. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
get anything here. I really do just want to get to know who you are. B, that means curiosity, genuine curiosity, which generates real questions of interest. And C, you do that with a sense of care. Because
Yeah.
when people start sharing their stories with you, they're sharing some of the most vulnerable parts of their lives. So we have to be very careful that we don't accidentally slip into some form of judgment of whatever the case is. But we create space in a sense to just hold their story as we get to know them, and ideally they get to know us as well. So that's high level.
Yeah. Really caring for people, really listening to them. I think there's a tendency for many of us to, when somebody begins to tell a story like why they believe whatever they believe,
Mm-hmm.
where we may want to jump in and interrupt or jump in to give a counterpoint, or we're thinking about our own response to whatever they're saying. But you're
Correct.
saying you don't do that.
No.
You pay attention, you care about them, and you listen to
Yes.
what they have to say. So that's a real sort of a different way of working with people to really try to understand them.
And you're prioritizing. There's a couple of things that's happening here. One, you're prioritizing relationship above politics, policy, so forth
Yeah,
and so on. Two, you're genuinely caring and being concerned about them. And three, you give up control. You conclude that you should focus on the input. I like to say this all the time. Let me love you and care for you and engage with you. And there's space for us to talk about the differences that we have on policy at the end of the day.
sure.
I'm not trying to control an outcome because people can tell whether you're trying to control an outcome or not. The genuineness of the experience is I release this. By the way, I had to learn this. This was a lesson I had to learn because as an evangelical Christian, I'm working with imams and rabbis and folk who are steep, but I want them to get to hear and know Jesus.
Hmm.
And I want them to get to know Jesus in a redemptive way. But I had to conclude that the best way for them to get to know Jesus was for me to be an authentic Jesus follower in relationship with them. And then leave it up to the Holy Spirit to work out anything else that he's going to work out. That was a huge learning for me
Yep.
in that context. So just to summarize, most of the time when Jesus interacted with people, it was unconditional. There was no initial strings attached. He just loved them, engaged with them, healed them, and then miracles happen on the other side of how he engaged. All right, I've given the big picture. Let me get just a little bit more specific here in terms of the how to. And this is how I kind of walk people through our congregation to it. So let's say that you're in a debate, a discussion about whatever the issue is. It's a policy, it's a theological, it's a cultural issue. The first thing I encourage you to do is you've got to just pause and ask for the story that's behind it. So essentially say, you know, tell me the story that's behind that particular position, or what is your personal experience that's actually shaping how you feel about X, Y, and Z. And as they start to share that, you're going to be listening for one or two things because usually they're there. One is at the core there's going to be some pain, some trauma, or there's going to be some fear. Here's what I'm afraid of, or here's how I got hurt before by X, Y, and Z, or here's how people treated me. So when you ask for their story and they share with you the story and you hear the pain or the fear, your next step is to connect with that pain, connect with that, acknowledge it, call it out, affirm it. Just say, I that must have been really hard. I'm just, I can't imagine how difficult that was. I'm so sorry that experience happened to you in that way. So you actually acknowledge and affirm the pain that comes with it. That's where the empathy comes in at. And then after you've heard their story, you've done the acknowledgement. Step 3 is you ask permission to share your story or your experience that's helping to shape and inform how you're thinking about it. And both when you're listening to them sharing their story and when you're about to share your story, you're not doing battle with them. You're not listening for all the holes when you're listening to their story so you can come back and prove them wrong. And when you share your story, you're not trying to share it in such a way that you can dismantle their argument. That's not the point. It is to authentically share your story, your experience, and where is the pain or the fear, or in some cases, maybe the dream that's connected too, on both sides, inside of your story. Where's that coming from? You authentically share that.
That's
And ideally,
very helpful. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, and ideally they connect with you around that. And then there's some space for you guys to kind of, now that you've got the story in mind, now we can go back and forth a little bit, but there's the empathy and the kindness and all of that is there because it's all seasoned by, I'm aware of your hurt and your pain and vice versa. So let's and oftentimes in that part of the exchange, transformation will happen. There'll be some movement in terms of what people think and believe and positions that they hold. If it's not 100%, it's 20%, 30%, whatever the case might be. But there will also be times, as it relates to these issues, that there'll be no movement. There's no change. You have the same conviction, they have the same conviction. Great. Then the last part of this is you negotiate boundaries. You say, okay, we're going to agree to disagree about this, but we're going to agree to disagree and still love. So now, how do we do this? What is the about? Maybe the boundaries are, we just won't talk about this part of the issue so that we can promote and protect and preserve our relationship. Or maybe the boundaries are, when we're in your house, we're going to do it this way because that reflects your deal. When you're in my house, we're going to do it this way because that reflects your deal. You negotiate boundaries and get very, very clear on what those boundaries are, which preserves and protects the relationship. And then finally, you release the outcome to God. Because what I have found is that over a period of time, if we can engage people with real love and care and honesty, in other words, we can have conviction with compassion, that it's not the persuasion that happens in the moment. It's what God does over time that helps them to connect dots. And us too, by the way.
Sure. Yep. Very good. Very, very helpful. Very powerful, Pastor Hurmon. Thank you so much. And part of what we've been talking about too is the difficulty that we have with labels
Yes.
when we label people. And I know Jesus had a lot to say about that, about ways of kind of breaking through labels.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about that? You think about, you've mentioned all the labels that we have, right? Liberal, conservative, black, white, as you say, East Coast, West Coast, rich, poor, whatever. There are many, many labels, and we tend to categorize people. But that was Jesus approached that subject. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Jesus always approached folk. I mean, check it out. There's a Roman soldier, centurion, who comes to Jesus. He represents the oppressive power. If you're a Jewish person, you're on the wrong side of that power. And the Roman soldier comes to Jesus and says, basically, I've heard about you. I believe in you. Would you heal my son? And but don't come to my house because I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. Just speak the word, and my son would be healed. Jesus didn't say, well, I'm kind of busy right now. Because, in our minds, the label is you are oppressor, right?
Right.
You're a part of the Roman power. Even in the larger text, he says he comes for the lost sheep of Israel, meaning I'm going to start the work of transformation, salvation with the Jewish community first. And it's going to spread out. This is a Roman soldier. They're interrupting on that. Jesus did not allow the label to get in the way. And again and again and again, as you kind of track with Jesus, he ignored the labels, right? And so prostitute, tax collector, all those, he just ignored those labels. Zacchaeus is that. No. He's dealing with, is the person ready for an encounter, and that's how he goes. Now, for me, it's personal, even more personal than that. No, let me just share another story. I didn't really recognize the power of labels until I went back to my hometown to speak to, maybe 10 years ago. I was invited back to speak to the Special Education Council, which was made up of all of the various department heads across River Parish who oversaw the special education curriculums in the various schools. And because I came out of special education in a very small town, my life was transformed. They brought me back to say a word that would be encouraging to these people who were in the trenches doing that work. It was a real honor of my life to be able to go back and do this. But the theme for the conference was, "You're not your label." And that was the first thing that grabbed hold of me, and I've never been able to shake it before. It immediately took me back to my childhood. And immediately took me back to the fact that I grew up as a very significantly scarred kid. An average person, particularly kids and others who interacted with me, when they first saw me, they saw me as a scarred kid. And this presented to them was not smart. They treated me a certain kind of way. All that was shaped by, particularly with the kids, all that was shaped by the girls wouldn't talk to me. I used to say, Skip, when I was in middle school, early high school, I chased a lot of girls. I just couldn't catch any of them.
Well, you did catch a good one, I'd say, Pastor Hurmon. Or she caught you.
I ain't bad. But it was all because label.
Yeah.
Right? And then I added to some of those labels because I was trying to get attention any kind of way I could. And so my behavior was dysfunctional. And so I helped to add additional labels. And so by the time I got to high school, I was the class clown. I was Herman the Monster, the one that's always creating chaos. So I had a number of labels, and yet I was not my label. I was more than my quote unquote these labels. So that's where this comes from. It's why I feel it's of such conviction. It's been my own experience. You can talk about it in terms of race as well. There's the spaces where certain people think a certain thing about you because you're African American. They kind of limit what experiences they think you've had or haven't had, and all of that in terms of my growing up years. And but you know what? We are not our labels. The labels may reflect dimensions of who we are, but we are so much more than our labels.
Well, I've heard you talk about, other specific actions we can take to break those labels. The tribes, especially, I would say that, we tend to identify with our tribe. I know earlier on I talked about how there's a tendency for all of us to sort of listen to the people that agree with us.
Yeah.
And we identify with that tribe. But talk a little bit about how you think, we can begin to sort of break loose of that sort of tribal identity.
Well, that's another practice that I think Jesus did extremely well. And I've kind of bundled two parts of it in what I call courageous integrity. Courage is a really big deal in this day and time, and integrity is, as I'm about to explain. Here's the point. In today's world, for any number of reasons, we feel really comfortable about going after, calling out, talking about the other people.
Yeah.
You can just define it. Talk about the other race, talk about the other political party, talk about the folk who are on the other side of the cultural issues. And where we see them wrong, We scream, yell, write about it to the top of our voices. No issues about that. Tackling people in our family, right? You're just wrong, but inside of that, and we create these other folk inside. But when it comes to the folk who we agree with, 98% of the time, and when we see them breach a value or do something that is inconsistent with who we are called to be, we tend to be quiet. And we don't say anything about that because in this world, it's important to have allies. And so I don't want to tamper with my allies. So I'm going to pretend I don't see that. And so I don't critique my own tribe, which makes me hypocritical, right? Yeah. I'm calling out a problem over there, but when it shows up here, I'm going to be quiet about it. Jesus was the opposite of that. Every time you read Jesus talking about Pharisees and Sadducees, calling them out, he was critiquing his own tribe. He was a part of that rabbinical tradition. Every time you read most of the prophetic words that show up in the Hebrew scriptures, they are written by Jewish prophets critiquing Jewish people, critiquing their own tribes. Huge part of the tradition. But it takes courage to do that because you may lose some allies and some alliances and so forth and so on. It takes integrity to do that. On the other hand, in our time, when we see in people that we regularly disagree with admirable traits, or when they do something that we actually deem to be right, again, we go quiet. Because we feel like if we call that out and affirm that, somehow we've lost the authority to hold them accountable for all these other things that we disagree with. But no, what we've done is lost our integrity. I tell the story, this real quickly, just in relational terms. My wife taught me this lesson. In the first 10 years of our marriage, really difficult, mainly because of me, just growing and maturing. I was convinced that, God had tricked her into marrying me, and one day she's going to wake up and realize she was going to be gold. But in either case, she came to me one day and she said, Herman, in terms of critiquing your own tribe, I was praying the other day and I was really praying to God that he really needed to fix you and work on these things with you. And I don't know how much I can take this and that. And the Lord whispered to me that I really need to focus on me, her own tribe, herself. I usually say it's critiquing yourself and or your own tribe.
Yeah.
And she said, so going forward, here's things that I'm going to be really working on. And I saw her work on those things. She went off and she overreacted or whatever. She'd come back later, she said, I should have reacted differently. And then celebrating the others, she came to me on another occasion and said, you know what? The Lord showed me that I'm always talking about what you get wrong. I never call out what you get right. And so he kind of laid on my heart that every day I'm going to call out one thing that you actually get right. And I'm going to celebrate it. I'm going to give you a hug for it. And she started doing that. And over a series of months, it dramatically helped her because she started seeing I actually was getting more things right than I got wrong, although the things I got wrong was significant. And both of those dramatically helped me because I saw that she was holding herself just as accountable as she was holding me. I no longer thought she was just attacking me. And she was also coupling that with affirming the things that I was working on getting right. So it totally changed the dynamics of our relationship and inspired me to want to be as faithful as she was being. That's what I mean when I say courageous integrity. And to shatter labels means I don't want to talk in labels. When I find people who share the same kind of tribe with me, dehumanizing people because they're labels, I need to call that out. Folk who I disagree with are doing some things right. I need to be able to say, you know what? That's right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your insights, the importance of engaging at the level of story and the need to get beyond labels. And for those of you listening, here's something simple to try this week. Think of one person you know, someone you have a meaningful disagreement with, maybe someone you've quietly put a label on. And if you're up to it, invite them to coffee or a walk or maybe just a conversation. And instead of debating, try this. Ask them, how did you come to believe what you do? And then, and this is the key, just listen. Don't interrupt, don't critique, just try to understand their story. You may not end up agreeing, but you might begin to see them differently. And ask them for permission to share your story, especially around the reasons why you came to believe what you do. And here's something interesting to consider. In your story, you might even criticize a person or beliefs in your tribe with whom you disagree, and perhaps offer praise for a person or belief in the tribe of the other person where you might think they have it right. Your colleague might begin to see you differently, and perhaps you both will see each other as people, not as stereotypical labels we put on each other. If this reflection resonates with you, I hope you'll join us in the upcoming episode. In the next episode, Pastor Hurmon and I will explore the power of practicing kindness and radical empathy as ways to build bridges across differences. And if you're a leader, and most of us are leaders in some way, you might find it meaningful to listen to my comments on leadership that accompany this podcast, and I'm calling it Leading the Jesus Way. You'll find links to this episode and past and future episodes in the Jesus Way series at skipvaccarello.com. You can also listen to them on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And to hear sermons on the Jesus Way and other messages from Pastor Hurmon, go to nbccbayarea.com. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, may each of us take one small step toward living and leading the Jesus Way.